Okay, so to my left is Alice Bolin, who is the author of Dead Girls, Essays on Surviving an American Obsession. She is assistant professor of creative nonfiction at the University of Memphis. Forgive me for reading. Sarah Nicole Prickett is a writer, and she writes for Artforum and Bookforum. Is there anything else that you want to say
No.
about that? Okay. Then we have Doreen St. Félix. She is a staff writer for The New Yorker. Before that, she was a culture writer for MTV News. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Vogue, Fader, and elsewhere. In 2017, she was a finalist for a National Magazine Award in columns and commentary. And finally, Amy Seimetz, who is a writer, actress, filmmaker. She is the co-creator and executive producer of the critically acclaimed Starz series, The Girlfriend Experience, based on Steven Soderbergh's film of the same name. Her feature film debut as a director, Sun Don't Shine, won a special jury prize at South by Southwest and was nominated for 2 Gotham Awards. What is exciting for me about this panel is that everyone comes from different realms. Everyone's a writer, a filmmaker. This conversation, this Me Too conversation, can be kind of seem like it's localized in one place where it really is this many-tentacled conversation. And so this is kind of a great cross-section of opinions and experience. So just to start off, sort of on a broad overview, this Me Too conversation, which has really exploded in the last couple of years, but with Harvey Weinstein being the main example in this industry in particular, there's been many different levels of this conversation, how it has impacted the industry, but also what interests me is like how it impacts how we receive stories, how we tell stories, the kinds of stories that might be told. So I was wondering if anyone had anything to say about that, about Me Too in the industry, but also in terms of storytelling and its impact. Well, maybe as a actress and a filmmaker who has been sort of on the independent side of it, but also with The Girlfriend Experience sort of happening at the same time as the Harvey Weinstein revelations were coming out. And the topic of Girlfriend Experience is kind of an interesting coincidence. So could you speak a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, it came out before any of that exploded, but that was definitely on our minds is sort of in creating the show is how women in professional fields are viewed when their sexuality comes into question, and sort of the shaming and slut shaming that accompanies that when it's realized that a woman is sexual or gets into a relationship with her boss or something like that, and sort of the stigma that is carried with being a sexual woman and a professional woman. And what we wanted to do is create a female character that was very unapologetic about that, and somebody who confronted, was not ashamed of her sexuality in any way, and it was interesting to watch the articles come out afterwards, because it seemed like it was such a powder keg of sorts, because and watching sort of the reaction of, like, this isn't feminist, and even though I'm the co-creator and writer-director, like, this isn't feminist, or this is extremely feminist, and just like sort of watching the conversation pieces that would come out of what is feminist and what isn't feminist, and how sort of fractured it all seems in a way. Yeah, I mean, that's my experience just in the actual, like, topic of or tackling something with a female character that's dealing with sexuality. I mean, behind the scenes, I think everyone is sort of, like, I think everyone's had an experience, whether it's been extreme, like, or, obviously Harvey Weinstein being the most egregious example of sexism, but there's a lot of, as a showrunner and somebody who runs my own show, there's a lot of, there's a lot of moments when I'm running my room or running my show where, and I'm sure you guys have had this instance where a man will second guess a decision that I make, and I have this conversation in my head where I'm like, do I call him out on it, or do I like bite my tongue? Is this a big deal? Am I gonna like blow it up for like a big deal? And I realized after the Me Too movement is that this is a conversation that is happening inside women's heads all the time, whether or not the comment that's being like, whether or not it's a completely innocent comment of like my second AC questioning whether or not I want a 50mm lens or something, or something like that it's a conversation that's in your head where you're like, do I blow this up? Do I point out that you're second guessing me? Do I do this? Da, 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 da. And then and a lot of times you stay silent because you don't want to rock the boat too much, or make an issue out of something that, especially because time is the essence when you're shooting, so I don't really
Pick your battles.
Yeah.
Doreen, I've been following your sort of articles about Me Too in The New Yorker, and they've been just essential reading for just sort of wading through this maze of all of these different intersections of, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about some of the work that you've been doing with the language around Me Too, the sort of paradigm shift that is happening, and how do we even speak about it?
I think that a lot of women journalists or critics who have been tasked with writing about Me Too,
Yeah.
the implication is that because you're a woman, you must implicitly want to comment on this. I don't know. You can't hear? Can you hear me now?
A little bit closer to the
Okay.
mic, maybe.
I will kiss the mic. There's been an existential question of whether or not Me Too actually is a movement, in the sense that is it nationwide? Is it penetrating? That's a terrible word to use in this context, but is it penetrating past these celebrity Hollywood circles? And I've found it, the reason why I've been so obsessed with language around what we call the anniversary of Me Too. So if we look at the timeline and consider the beginning to be the reporting on Harvey Weinstein, that would be October 2017, and now we're November 2018, and there's been an assumption that there has been a year of reflection that is, the idea is that everyone has been thinking about Me Too over this past year, and that's just it's not necessarily true. And so for me, I think maintaining a sense of proportion has been critical in terms of my role as a critic and also as a journalist. It's just kind of being honest with the fact that it matters that Me Too has been glamorized in a certain way and has been attached to public figures who already had our trust, or who have already been churned through certain systems that encourage us to look at them as people who should feel, Sarah was talking about this yesterday, entitled to being hurt. And in my writing, I'm often thinking about populations of people who don't feel that entitlement, or who don't necessarily look at the pain that they've experienced as pain that necessarily ranks higher when they compare maybe the racial abuse they might experience in workplaces. I think the workplace is the central theater of this, the abuse in the way that we've been thinking about that. And that's already, we have to think, if we're thinking about, what is the contract between a male boss and his female employer, how does that prevent us from thinking about instances that should be in the Me Too movement involving domestic violence or family violence? That's not a workplace. And so I've just felt, as always with language, that it's asymptotic, and I always worry, in our rush to generalize, in our rush to describe things as movements wherein everyone just joins the rising tide, I just think that we've created more blind spots than we've necessarily illuminated in the past year, and I find that to be a huge hurdle to clear in my own work.
And the 90,000 farm workers.
Right. We were just
Do you
talking.
remember this?
Yeah, we should talk about
The farm workers, I think, were they a union? No, they were unionizing.
I don't think that they were unionizing. I think it was just a collection.
Right, okay. Female farm workers wrote a letter in support of the Me Too movement. We were talking about this in the car, and you told me the Time's Up official response, which was so funny.
Yeah, it was basically, I think it was 70 or 90,000 farm workers, female farm workers working in the U.S., predominantly of Hispanic origin, also many black women too. They wrote a letter in support of Time's Up, and it was just this totally discombobulated direction, right? It's that Time's Up with its resources, with its veneration in the news, should be supporting a movement like that Farm Workers Alliance, but it happened the other way around, and I think that was such an interesting, it was just emblematic of how social justice movements cannot be centered around necessarily the victims who are easiest to sympathize with, or the victims who are easiest to love, just in a generalized way.
Yeah, and the demented irony of the Time's Up Twitter account tweeting thank you for your solidarity. It's just, I don't know, just an extraordinary kind of class unconsciousness that I guess makes me laugh because I don't have a useful response.
This sort of leads into what I wanted to ask Alice about. There is a new literary prize for the thriller genre called the Staunch Prize that will give a prize to a book that doesn't feature a woman being raped or beaten or mutilated or whatever. I'm really interested in your work on the dead girl, which is really the dead white girl, the Laura Palmer, the Image. I mean, Criminal Minds, the entire series is about, if you're a woman, you might as well just not leave the house because they're, So could you really speak about that? Because that gets into stories and how we receive stories, how we criticize stories, the different points of view, to be more aware of it.
Yeah, see, now I sound really loud. Everyone else, I'm awesome. Speak up. Okay. This is the thing that that I'm just sitting here mulling over in my mind, because it feels of course, we're talking about two different things, or maybe more than two different things, about what women have to say, and also about the ways that women are allowed to say it. And I think that this thing, people keep asking me about it, this prize, literary prize for, something that doesn't feature violence against women. I think it's funny because it's like the Bechdel test, where it's such a low bar, really, to jump over. It's oh, you didn't write about, a woman being horribly raped. Good for you, here's a prize. When really you're just rewarding some sort of ingenuity of narrative in any way. So I guess I feel ultimately when people ask me about these things, it's well, we have much further to go than just saying no dead girls. And I think a lot of people would argue that dead girl stories are useful in a lot of ways, especially to sort of interrogate why we love dead girl stories so much. I can't remember what I was going to say about this, but I guess it's I was thinking about I was watching the movie Chocolat. I had to watch it the other month with friends. I was wow, this is the worst movie I've ever seen. It was truly awful. Not for any political reason, I just thought it was a really bad movie. And you can disagree with me, that's fine. But I was thinking about how much it, to me, typified this sort of middle brow, Oscar bait kind of movie that I hate. I'm just being controversial. You can disagree with me, it's fine. But
No one likes chocolate.
You no, it sucks, right? It's terrible.
It's not
but I just mean I'm not trying to be I'm not trying to outlaw it. I'm not trying to cancel it. I'm just saying that's my opinion. But well, of course, the fact that these movies that are so mediocre are made and are so popular also has to do with some sort of patriarchal order who gets to say yes or no. And of course that movie came out from Miramax or the Weinstein Company. So it's it's not unrelated. It's not. The fact that if we, actually do have, fairness in labor and representation, the movies do get better. And so it's not just about, it's both about who gets to talk and about what we get to say.
Wait, is there a dead girl in Chocolat?
No, I don't know why I brought up chocolat,
Well, I
but
guess it would have been eligible for a prize then.
right, it would have been like, you're right. It should win a prize for having no dead women.
Well, this is kind of like a lot on Twitter with film critics, and there are like, there was a hashtag recently like, if a woman directed, and it'll be, if a woman directed Psycho, if a woman directed, and I had sort of mixed feelings about it, because I was like, well, I'm maybe we don't want to like limit how women want to tell stories or the kinds of stories. It's not that women are going to automatically make a more, anyway. So this goes back to sort of the, what Amy was saying about like what is feminist, or like this isn't feminist. Like, well, if I'm a woman making it and I have my, I don't know. Do you have any more thoughts on that? Your
Well,
experiences with that?
I definitely have to take a hard no on there's a way a woman directs. Like that always pisses me off.
Yeah.
And that I couldn't, that as if I'm, like agencies are always sending me like Eat, Pray, Love scripts, and I'm like, that's just not my bag. And obviously, I like make very, excuse my language, like fucked up movies, and so I have no, so that sort of pisses me off. But I will say in directing my own stuff, but then in a few other things in visiting, directing on Atlanta too, that I brought up that time is the essence on set. And I do know that there are certain things that, and I also act too, and so there's certain scenes that like finding the subtlety or finding the complicated nature of things you're always getting rushed to do, mostly when I have no control over. But and I do find that when we come to a scene that like on the page maybe for me is like just like a two-liner, and my AD maybe scheduled it or tried to schedule it for like 15 minutes, or I don't know, for whatever, I make a point to say, no, this scene's going to take a lot longer because I need to find the complexity within it. Mm-hmm. And I do think that takes, not just gender specific, but experience specific, of different backgrounds. Of like, I don't want to just, because just using the girlfriend experience as an example is like, I have no interest in watching bodies bang and together and then be like, look, there's sex on the screen. It's like, to me, it's like, this is going to take time to find the complexity and the exchange of these human beings, because I have no interest in showing a young woman just to show a young woman having
Right.
sex. And so I take the time. And so I think that's where it becomes an interesting discussion, is like, yes, it does make a difference who's directing. I'm not saying that every woman is right, or every woman could like bring sensitivity to this, because I definitely am not that woman. But there are certain moments that I do think, because of the specificity of your experience, whether that's being a woman, whether that's being black, whether that's being an immigrant or whatever, those are the moments that bring the specificity of direction and voice that like we haven't seen, like that on a very, very like nuts and bolts production level. Those are the moments where you need somebody to say, no, we can't rush over this, and there's something more complicated to be in here.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I am going to be on a podcast next week about Ida Lupino, who was a wonderful actress, and also she was a pioneer in that she created a production company, and she was like the only female director in the 50s in Hollywood. And she developed her own stuff, and one of her first films was a film called Outrage. I don't know if any of you have seen it. And it's about a girl who is raped and then basically it's about the PTSD that follows. And it's 1950, And I was watching it and I was thinking about, God, okay, she's the only one. It's not that men can't sort of get into an empathetic mode and tell stories like that, but what would it have been like if there had been so many examples of that, and that so many examples of female-led stories. It doesn't matter what the result is, it's just more voices, more, anyway, it's just very interesting. And another element of that is that women are not all the same.
What?
You know, I can't remember, one of you said that basically women are not given as much leeway in stories to screw up. And I found that it's very true, what you were saying about. Doreen, as a critic, I've read a really interesting thing that you wrote about being a critic and coming into this sort of conversation as a critic, and this is part of the conversation about how things are reviewed, how things are seen. Wonder if you could speak about that a little bit.
Can you elaborate a little bit?
Can you hear
more?
that? Yeah. Well, I mean, I've read a lot of your film criticism, and the conversation around diversity in film criticism is a really important one. I work at RogerEbert.com. They sort of assign movies not based on, oh, you're a woman, here's this, which is really good. But you're sort of into criticism and the...
Talk about, you know what you're really good at is writing about like women's voice, like talk about like singers writing about women's voices. You're so good at describing like the actual quality of a woman's voice, and that can be like a metaphor.
Well, yeah, it's funny. I actually did start off practicing music criticism, and that was because for a very long time I just didn't really know how to read films, and music was something that I felt that I understood both the process of making, and also I understood what sort of effect it was supposed to enact on its consumer, in this case being the listener. And I think as I like sort of played with the idea of being a roving cultural critic whose topics sometimes include film, probably like an internal battle that I have with myself is how can I undermine this expectation that representation is some sort of mystical force that therefore imbues a certain work with like a transcendence. And I've often found that more often than not thinking, I know that there are expectations that because I'm a black person and I'm a woman and I'm a black person who is a woman, people might expect that I will be able to see into texts and be able to sort of like divine why these works are necessary. And I think necessary is a word that has been coming up a lot in criticism as it's become more diverse. And the whole implication of that is being like, this work is necessary because it gives me a window in which I can be an expert, you know. The black critic or the black woman critic has not been considered to have expertise in texts that don't involve her identity. And so I think in a lot of ways I've been working against identity and thinking much more deeply about actual aesthetic, which I think is what Amy's comments make me think about. I get so frustrated when a creator makes something that's like extremely like layered and it's both internally coherent but also contradicting itself. The work is really alive, and then all of a sudden you see it get reduced to the fact that that creator, you know, came from Africa at a certain time in history. And I just like diversity is a word that has just become a cipher and a void, and I think it's really impoverished the way that we look at a lot of the popular mediums, right? So primarily television. Like people have talked about how in the past 15 years there's been like a renaissance in black television, and of course that's not true. You look at history, you look at the 90s, and there were actually more, there's more black television, and also these makers were producers and they were directors and they were creators, whereas now the actual like number of black creators, producers, it doesn't even compare to what we were looking at a generation before. So yeah, I have like a perpetually cynical relation to the way that I'm looked at as, you know, someone who has special insight into works that might be considered diverse. Like, I think maybe I should just become like a sports writer or something and focus on baseball.
Wesley Morris wrote a piece about, it was in the wake of all of this Harvey Weinstein stuff. He basically was like, he wrote this piece about Annabella Sciorra. He was like, okay, you know, one of the tragedies of this is that we have been denied, you know, 20 years of this woman's work. She was like frozen out and so traumatized. So he did this kind of beautiful tribute to her career. And I mean, I was wondering if any of you had any thoughts about some of the other sort of maybe not as obvious fallouts from this structure, this sort of structure in the industry.
You mean other actresses who might have simply stopped working out of
Yeah.
trauma or shame? Yeah, I mean,
Or like the stories that aren't told, the stories that may be told, the things that are greenlit, you know, it's...
Yeah. No, of course, it's something to think about all the time is, you know, it's very frustrating, our inability to see what's not there. I mean, that's the source of all religion, is that we're like compelled to look for things that we don't see. You talk about representation and what it means or doesn't mean to see your experience represented on screen. This isn't really a direct answer to your question, but when we're talking about the limits of representation and invisibility, it's interesting to think about what are the spoken tenets of Me Too. So Me Too infers a kind of relatability. We've all been there, cornered in that restaurant, or we've all had that experience or a version of that experience. And then the experiences are so similar because men are so uncreative in their methods of assault that, of course, all the women's stories now sound like plagiarism, like everyone, it sounds like we're all just copying each other when we tell these stories. So, you know, something that's interesting when Ida Lupino does it. And, you know, her story or her making that movie, you really think, did that happen to her?
Sure.
And you think about actually how many women artists have had as their primal scene a rape, like Artemisia Gentileschi, you know, if you know anything about like 16th century Italian painting, that's her story as well. She was famously a rape victim and then became like the greatest female painter. So it's a very powerful experience, but if everyone suddenly is confessing to having it, then it loses its narrative power. And it feels like, oh, well, so what's the point of my even saying this? I can't even get anything out of it. We're not even going to be able to market these stories anymore because the news cycle will eventually have to move on. And the other part of, you know, the discourse about representation and visibility is that being visible makes you a target and makes you easier prey. So, you know, you're talking about like seeing more diverse people on screen, yet the people who have the real power are somewhere way back behind the screen, not even behind the camera, further behind that. So is this kind of power to decide what gets made, is this something that more women should have? I'm very uneasy about women seeking power because with that comes the hubris that makes someone's downfall so attractive. I don't necessarily want everything that men have. I don't want to be ugly, for instance. I saw someone tweet last year after the election, oh, what if an ugly woman ran for president? Like, that's her big dream. Like, what? Ugly people got us into this mess. So that, and my reaction to that is sort of applicable across different industries, whether it's the industry of government or a film. Does that make sense? Like,
yeah.
Do we want what men have, or do we want to continue to be antagonistic? Do we want to have to be better than men? Or is that an unfair double standard?
Well, I think there's something like what you're saying is like so interesting, where it's almost like you're saying like that men are sort of ventriloquizing women in the Me Too movement, like that rape is sort of like the story we get to tell at this point, or harassment. That's the truth of female experience as filtered through men's opinions. Well, and I think I'm not saying that's what you're saying. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. It's just kind of like my brain working, but where I think that if there's the thing that's cliche about it, or like, because cliches have lies like in them. If they weren't lies, they would be like truisms or something, or like aphorisms or something. Where like the lie of it is that rape is something that happens to women, when the truth is that rape is something that happens to everyone, and even sexual harassment, and because it's all about that negotiation of power. I think if people were honest, we would say that, most men have been in that experience too, to the extent if we are, and I'm not saying that it's not gendered, but I also think that once rape becomes this really essentialist idea, we really lose a lot of the truth of it. And it does become kind of sentimental, that story.
Sentimental how?
That idea that rape is something that women, like a rite of passage.
Right. Or that there's a
It's this-
prelapsarian idea of the girl,
Right,
and rape changes everything.
right.
Yeah.
Well, I think I read an interview maybe with you about your book where you were talking about, the sort of trope of the dead girl has this it works on us in a powerful way. Not that, and why is that different from a dead boy? Or that, maybe in 19th century literature, I think that you had mentioned that there was anyway, could you speak a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, it's like, this is something I'm really interested in, is the way that image of a dead girl is so compelling in like film or TV that it has become, like a trope that's repeated again and again. And we're really desensitized to that imagery. But God, I was going to say something about this, and now I'm lost my train of thought.
Well, I have a question. Maybe
Yes.
you know this from researching your book. I'm aware of the idea throughout literature, like from the time of, have you ever read Clarissa?
No, I know about it though.
Yeah. Well, has anyone read Clarissa? Any
Dan
English
has.
lit scholars? Okay.
My boyfriend has read it.
Okay, great. So you know that in that novel, which is an epistolary novel, there's very strongly expressed is the idea in the culture, or like a religious idea, that rape is a fate worse than death. And yes, rape happens to many people of different genders. It's my understanding that only in literature for girls is there the idea that rape is a fate worse than death. I don't know whether this is an idea that boys or anyone else receives, but I could be wrong. I don't know.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, right. I mean, I think that is the idea, that it's like this girl is sort of used up anyway, or, she's kind of, she's no good anymore, clearly, like this violated body. But I think there's also a level where she's sort of like a dream girl. She's perfectly objectified because now she's a corpse, like she's an object. And I also think there's something there about this sort of like deep, primal, appeal of like women's sexuality or something. I mean, I was thinking about like that Anne Carson, she has this essay called The Gender of Sound that's about the female voice. And in it, she basically says that women speak in upsetting ways about upsetting things. So our voices are loud and shrill and terrible to hear. And that we also say things that are inappropriate or forbidden or whatever. And that perfectly silent, dead woman is sort of that forbidden speech kind of made incarnate or something. That it's sort of everything that's forbidden about women is embodied in that taboo image of a dead girl.
Wow, it's very powerful. Maybe we should open it up for some questions?
Can I just?
Oh, yeah,
I was
go.
just
Run with it.
Because the interesting thing that you said about the 90s and TV, and I'm curious about like what the Me Too movement will actually do in the film industry. my experience has been an interesting one. I know I brought up like somebody questioning my lens choice, but I like combating. Like I can go head to head with people, and that's the beauty of film, is like the best idea in the room. Like I want people to be like, what about this or whatever. But there's a difference between collaboration and questioning your ability. But the interesting thing is that what I found in most of the films that I love, including Wanda that's here, is that there for me as like a woman and watching female characters, there were so many, like we seemed like we were going on such a cool track in like the 70s and early 80s, and then something just happened
Yeah,
where
relatability happened.
Yeah,
This is why Me Too is so problematic vis-a-vis art, because actually relatable art is an ideal, not for me.
right.
People think characters are relatable sometimes when they're unrelatable because they recognize there's something aspirational, there's something ideal. Creating something new for you to relate to is what the most legendary art tends to do. But relating to what's already there feels very stifling in a way. And so that we're at this weird kind of, like cross purposes almost, in terms of a movement that's all about saying Me Too, and then also this commensurate push for more women to tell stories, where you basically have to stand there at the end of the day and be like, I alone, I decide, right?
Right.
I'm going to arrogate all of this beauty, the beauty of creation, to myself and make something extraordinary.
Yeah, and to compare to, like, so Elaine made Heartbreak Kid. I just rewatched it, and it's amazing, and it's about a bachelor, and the women in it are hilarious.
Love
and
that
yes, like
movie,
his
yeah.
wife is like annoying, but like in a really, really loving, like like Elaine she made her so, I like love that woman. And then she just directed it in such a way. There's a remake that came out, and I was just curious because I just rewatched this recently. There's a remake that came out, and not to knock the filmmakers, but I was reading just the description of it, and it said when whatever Ben Stiller's character's name is in the movie, I don't know if they renamed him, when he finds out that the woman he married is a shrew. And I was like, you took all of the subtlety and like the fun, like it
Wow,
was like,
yeah.
and it just boiled it down. And this is a movie that was made 10 years ago, and I feel like we were on a trajectory of something really, really interesting, not just with like women, but just like characters in general, and discussing like diversity and race and everything. And then suddenly, I don't know what happened, but
Well, now
it
they
just
wanna
got
remake-
weird and.
I had
What-
I had the same thought a couple of weeks ago. There's a show in New York at the Shiva Gallery at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and it's called The Unheroic Act: Representations of Rape in Women's Art. And so the remarkable part of that title, of course, is at the end, because rape has an iconography, and that has been historically, literally until the 20th century, been drawn by men. And so this is a show. It doesn't have like Frida Kahlo in it by any means, but the first work I think is by Yoko Ono and John Lennon in 1968. And the most recent work involves some students literally like after the Me Too movement, and it's a Me Too piece. And I think what's so interesting is that a lot of the works that were made in the 80s and also in the 90s, like Kara Walker, for example, she has a panel in the show, and all of the works are reacting against Susan Brown Miller's 1975 text, which is called Against Our Will. And so all of our scripts and narratives about rape, the way we talk about it, basically come from this book, in which Susan Brown Miller looks at the history of Western art and decides that these men painted rape to be a romantic act, an act of conquest, rape obviously coming from the Latin meaning kidnapping, seizing assets from the male protagonist also. So rape has historically been, the loss has been another man's loss, not a
It's
woman's
property
loss.
theft,
Right,
basically,
it's property theft. And these were works that they were just so violent, and talking about dead girls and objectification, these were works in which women artists were objectifying the women that they were either showing in some works are actually like figuration, other works are abstract. And I think that there has been a push to sort of like turn away from the violence of the act, because violence or showing bodies enduring violence is supposed to be like inherently dehumanizing. And I think that the fact of the matter is that the act involves dehumanization. And when, I don't know, it was just like I was watching these women artists who were just like not afraid to, I'm sorry, this is like very explicit and trigger warnings, but in Kara Walker's panel, like she shows a white man in the 19th century like raping a 12-year-old black girl, and you see their crotches meeting. And there was something about like the lack of censorship and just, obviously there were psychological dimensions to the work, but these women were actually just like showing the image of rape. And in that room, I realized rape was something that I'd been told about as a girl, but until I had my first actual experience of assault, I didn't even know what it looked like. I didn't even have a script for it. And I don't think that we should take for granted that conversations about rape are tied to iconography, and that there were many women artists in the 20th century who had to create this like very visceral, brutal, violent iconography just so that we knew what this thing that existed in the ether, so we knew what it actually looked like.
Well, so I'm a professor of creative nonfiction, and in my nonfiction workshops, often when we discuss work like that we're reading, like assigned texts, my students will reject things especially in work, like if I want to talk about work by women, things that are imaginative or confrontational or, experimental, and they will praise things that are sort of received or cliched, and what often they will say is that they're honest, which to me is like I'm not allowing them to use that word anymore, because we are not able to judge what is honest or what is not honest. I mean, these are artists who are making choices, but also because we want to, often I think like we are trained to receive the things we've already received before as the truth. And like I was thinking about how women, like what you guys are talking about, where about relatability, which is also sort of a no word in, my classroom. But the ways that women's art that is the most interesting is often the most confrontational or something. Confrontational is not even quite the right word. But I was thinking about Zia Anger, who just did this amazing presentation about her first feature film. Incredible, yeah. And that she talks about, in this work, she talks about things that were very personal, or even you could say confessional, but ultimately the sort of vulnerability she showed was about, professional failure or rejection. And that's something that I think is unexpected, or it's a revelation in a way that you think, well, that's actually the thing that's most upsetting or traumatic about that experience. Was not the personal revelation about her personal life, but about her professional life. I think that's something that, like, to me, it was a case study in the ways that women's art can be revelatory and can draw from other forms, or earlier narratives, and then flip them. Anyway, I just wanted to talk about how good it was. I hope you guys were all there. It was amazing.
So we have time for some questions. Anyone?
I read a book on female filmmakers throughout history, and that in the late 80s, early 90s, really was financing films sort of changed the game, and that's where we've seen that structure of women having those roles go away. I'm just wondering where the money control comes back from, or I don't know how to ask that properly, but I think you're not.
I think I get it. Amy, what do you think?
This is actually something I was going to bring up, and it's like a gross part that nobody ever talks about, and I don't know how to make it end. Whenever you're getting a film financed, you go to, I'm not going to name somebody, but like a film sales place, whatever, and they basically are like that your film can be made for 10 million or however. I've never had a $10 million movie, but your movie can be made for XYZ amount of money if you have this list of actors. And what they base that off of are international sales. And so they always, there's this conversation that starts to be a snake eating its tail when you walk into those rooms, because you're like, I want this to be like an African-American actor. I want this to be a female lead. And they always go back to, well, it's not American like box office. It's when we go overseas, they won't buy it if you have a black lead or a female lead, or it's in a different language. Like and then it's like, right, but then how do we redefine that? And like we should like show them American, because they want American movies. Everyone's buying American movies. So let's just continue to like make these movies, and then they'll just get used to it. And but no, you can't talk to money people that way, or transgender, or what, you know what I mean? Like that's like it's this but I don't know how to stop it. I just know it's the most infuriating thing ever. And nobody talks about that, and film sales people won't talk about it publicly, but it is out of them.
Anyone else? Any other questions?
We don't know anything about that.
I know. I'm like, what is money?
Questions, comments?
Hi, Jesse. I'm sorry. What? That's my husband. My husband has a question about how streaming services will affect feminism in 2018. No, okay, the question, is more better. I mean, if there are more shows, then they can, I guess they can take more risks, maybe. I mean, I think that what they do, my understanding is that they don't really take more risks. They test out different markets.
They replicate.
Like, they're like, okay, well, what if we made like a teen drama, but it was really woke, and it was about witches? Or like, what if we made like a family sitcom, but it wasn't funny, and it's also not good? You know what I mean? Like, they're just saying, like,
They're
is
like,
there
it
a
was very
market?
popular.
Yeah. What if we made a show about detectives hunting down serial killers, and we showed in one episode a clip of Dog Day Afternoon, just so everyone knows that they don't live in a time when anyone cares about movies the way that they did in the 70s? Are people gonna sit there and like have that for lunch or whatever? You know, like, are people gonna swallow this if we feed it to them? So that's my understanding. If more shows on Netflix meant riskier shows, like experimental television, very creative, unusual work with a diverse set of directors who were all allowed the leeway of like a Woody Allen at Amazon, that would be interesting, but they don't want people to be interested. They want people to like fall asleep watching their dumb shows and then wake up and go to their dumb jobs and order stuff on Amazon in the middle of the day because they're so bored. Yeah. Yes?
This is like maybe more like an emotional question, but because you're all working with these things, with these topics or ideas, or you're kind of brushing up against these things that are like sometimes really hard to stomach, sometimes really hard to process, and all of your work is processing this. How do you, as human beings, like you're artists and you're human beings, and these worlds live together, like how do you in these moments kind of create space for yourself not to get like incredibly overwhelmed by the like total black hole of it all? Because I think a lot of this stuff around Me Too turns into this insane echo chamber, and so how do you, as when you brush up against it and your work brushes up against it, not just like fall into the hole?
Of like fall into like the dark, you mean the dark hole of life? yeah, I don't know.
Really practical, like
Oh no, I know. Yeah.
really pragmatic, like this is what I do.
Yeah. Well, I play tennis. But no, I actually like I was just talking about this, is that I'm writing stuff for television. There's a lot, and because I came from the independent film world, I was never writing for something. And I find that pressure to be insane because it's whether, even if it comes out positive, because they come to me and they're like, ooh, we need a complicated female character. Let's go to Amy, right? And then I'm like, well, like, what does that mean? Like, she's like having an affair and she's a top hired, like, like she's a big lawyer in New York City. I don't really understand what you want, and it just comes out of me. And so I have to give myself like a lot of pause with that, and a lot of pause. I mean, like procrastination style pause, and then write stuff for myself that outside of all of that, just to get back to see if I'm being honest with myself in my writing for other people, and because I'm sure with the topics that you have to write for, they want a thing. For this, and then you have to take pause and understand if you're being honest with yourself and bring that to the thing that's for this other topic, if that makes sense.
I mean, I'm sure you guys, I'm sure you guys have had this experience where someone asks you to write something because they like your writing, and then you say, okay, and you write it, and they don't like it because they didn't really want you. Maybe I'm the only person who had this experience. Now I'm like feeling insecure. But, because they didn't really want you to do your thing. They acted like they liked the thing that you did, but really they wanted you to do the thing that they do or that their outlet does. And I don't know. I mean, I don't think it's unique to women necessarily, but I do think that sort of finding a way to do you, in this sort of hostile environment is difficult as an artist.
Yeah, but that's why you just should do less. Just take longer and do less is my feeling about how to solve all of this. Marilyn Monroe, you might know this, but when you were talking about procrastination, as it seems like it's a way of, what's that? Is that Shonda Rhimes, reclaiming your time?
Yeah,
Who said that?
Maxine Waters.
Maxine Waters, but, oh my God, Shonda.
Shonda Rhimes said, fuck ABC, get and Netflix money. That's what she said.
Oh, that's what she said, yeah. So anyway, Marilyn Monroe would procrastinate like crazy, and when it came to just showing up at work, arriving on set, and she said that the later she went, the more powerful she felt, or she didn't really put it in those words, but it was a reaction to feeling powerless and feeling like she was being used in ways she didn't like and being asked to play characters she didn't respect and so on. And she was like, well, how am I going to get a sense of myself and my space and time back? I'll just be 3 and 4 hours late, to the point that Laurence Olivier wants to fucking strangle me, on a set. So, I don't know. But I think taking more time is, taking more time to get ready is a great feminine thing.
I just try to write in the tone that I actually experience things, as opposed to adopting either the formality or the somberness that the medium calls for. There's so many times I read pieces where I'm like, you don't talk like that, or you don't think like that, because no one does. You sound like an automaton. And so one simple trick that I found very helpful is actually dictating some essays prior to. Yeah, I really give my phone a workout, and now I have a weird pain in my wrist because I'm always holding it this way as I speak these essays into existence. But I found it useful, obviously, and then you go back and actually massage and then smooth and make it technically an essay. But I found that dictating them just forces me to, I think I used this phrase before during this panel, but really be honest with my sense of proportion, which is to say something terrible might happen in society and I actually might not be feeling apocryphal about it. I actually might feel that it's banal, or I might feel in 1 second totally devastated by it, and then the next second I'll feel my mind wandering. And I try to just make my essays feel like they're being written in media res. And I think that's because, as somebody who writes on the internet, I think of it as a immediate form, or a form in which you can write things that you'll disagree with like a day after. And so I'm not really interested in being authoritative right now, and I'm more interested in being literally reflective, like in the sense of a mirror, not reflective necessarily in how deeply I'm thinking about things, but in the way that it's just like a freeze frame of the chaos of my brain at any moment.
Well, it feels like it feels so rejecting of like some male idea of authorship or auteurship, indeed.
It's Zora Neale Hurston.
Yeah.
You know? People will idolize Zora Neale Hurston now and visit her grave, but the fact is you couldn't visit her grave until Alice Walker went there in the 70s and found it and got her headstone. In her day, like part of the reason why she like founded the Niggerati was because it was people like Richard Wright who thought that she was unseemly because she was writing in vernacular, because she was writing things the way that they actually were, because she was going to Florida and Haiti and Jamaica and like reproducing the way that people actually speak. We could talk about Barracoon, which came out this year, which I think is an example of like, oh, all the women's work that we don't get to see, sometimes people save it and then we get to see it, 80 years after the fact.
Everything Richard Wright hated makes a really good reading list.
It's true. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, I wasn't really saying anything. I was just like prompting you to talk more, which you did. It was great.
I respond to prompts.
Yes?
Yeah.
Now? I can.
Yes.
Yes.
Sure.
I have a question that's kind of, I want to just suspend for a second the like grammar of the panel title, right? And to think about the actor and like something that I always think about with panels like this is like, what would you be doing? What would you be talking about? What would you be making if you didn't have to talk about this shit?
Right.
Like, 'cause so much of your like professional energy, right? Like it's spent on doing this, right? But I know that for me, like when I make stuff and I feel like, oh, fuck, I want to write about science, I want to write about like sports. That there's so many things, but there's a sense of almost like, well, I'm not doing that. I don't know about this person, So, or you feel like that can't help out. But I'm just curious, like, is that something that you think about, or if you're like, this is actually what I want to say?
No one wants
Right.
to do this.
And then can I also
Some people do.
add,
Yeah.
Amy, how do you
Not
feel
me.
having like made work that gets shoehorned in these narratives of being like, right, or Me Too, after like
it's
having
another.
already
It's
chosen your
it's the
subject.
same. It's a frustrating thing. It's like I said. I don't. I want to be known for my ideas, not because of my vagina. I mean, that's just the truth. I want to be as intelligent as anyone else, which is why I made the point of like I want people to give me ideas. I want to combat on set. And the interesting thing after the Me Too thing is what I noticed from directing and running shows is that people were really scared of me, and they were scared of saying ideas, and it was a less like, "Are you sure?" It was like, "Hey, why don't you do that? Never mind, it's your job." And I was like, "No, like, I want to hear. Like, I'm your
Right.
equal. That's all I ever fucking want. I didn't want to like run the. I mean, we should, but I, like I wanted to just be equal. So I don't. And the interesting thing is that right now I'm at film festivals and sort of in these dialogues, and obviously I let all these essays and like things happen percolate in my head, but I'm not like sitting around thinking, again, sorry to talk about my vagina, but like I don't ever talk about my vagina. But like I'm not sitting like, oh, like because I'm female, I should shoot it from this angle. You know what I mean? Like it's more. It's like that. I'm female, but I'm also I'm the sum of all of my experiences, which means I started medical school and dropped out. Like it's so I don't think about it all the time. But when I'm specifically like what I was saying is, but there are times, like I was saying, when you do look at the board, and this goes for all experiences. The board meaning when you're shooting your script, there are moments where it's like, oh, this is very personal to me, and I need to spend time on it because I've seen this in movies and it really bothers me. Sometimes that's because it's a female thing. Sometimes it's because it's a trope that I've seen a million times, and it doesn't always have to do with being a woman. And I think just being honest, just period, and being a woman and like is enough to. You don't have to just constantly write about it. You know, I think actually the opposite is true, is that more women should be writing about science fiction, and more women should be writing in these genres, and more women should be like making Black Widow, and you know, I mean, I just think that and it shouldn't just be Wonder Woman. You know what I mean? It should be something like bringing something else, and that goes for like just any diversity in general.
I always think that if my perspective is uniquely valuable because I'm a Black woman, wouldn't people want me to be writing more about white art? Like, wouldn't that be like where I would be trenchant, you know? And so I think about that a lot. Like, there's this, it's not, I mean, it's always been the case, but like there's an expectation that like there's like a tacit agreement between the Black critic and the Black creator that we have a symbiotic relationship here. Your existence implies mine and vice versa. And I obviously resist that just because like that's not the way that I think about art, but also because I don't think that your identity obviously precludes you from experiencing certain things and also means that you're going to experience other things, right? And that's a kind of knowledge or expertise. But I also think it just like, you have a vantage point, and that's fascinating. And like I think if I were to like imagine, you know, if I was choosing the pieces that I was assigned to write, or choosing the works that I was like chosen, or that I wanted to appraise, like it probably would be primarily by white creators, just because like I'm very like fascinated by it. And obviously we can talk about like the market of ideas and scarcity complexes and economies in which there is just more to evaluate by white people. But I find that I'm activating my vantage point the most when I'm looking at, you know, like my supposed like racial opposite. And it just seems like the most exciting and interesting to me. So I guess I want to write about white art more. And we should call it white art too, which we never seem to do.
Yeah, I think, well, it's funny for me, since my book came out, I have been getting more opportunities to write for different outlets, but a lot of the time what they ask me to write is about dead girls, and they like that's my beat now, which for me was sort of unexpected or strange because I felt like I wrote the book in order to move through that narrative towards something else and to be trying to look out towards a new way of, you know, thinking about women's stories. So I mean, I don't want to proliferate those stories or criticism about those stories, and for me, what's true is other ideas in criticism that I find interesting, like about women's magazines or about, you know, like lady YouTubers, like I wrote for Sarah years ago, things that are about women and maybe are about feminism too, but maybe not in the ways that I have come to like be associated with. I think that's part of it. Is I'm really interested in women's experience, of course, and women in the media and lady authors and whatever. But I'm not necessarily interested in, you know, talking about it the same ways it's been talked about forever. I would love to, you know, find new pockets that haven't been explored and write about that.
I mean, I think that is what to explain. Maxine Waters said, reclaiming my time, like on the floor of the Senate or something, and then in a discussion with the Time's Up movement, Shonda Rhimes was like, we're reclaiming our time, to be like, you know, just to repurpose that very nice phrasing, to say like, in talking about this, in saying like, whatever, time's up, you know, we're hoping to bring this story to an end. This long story about women's rapes, assaults, abuses, etc. That if we can dramatize this story, then maybe we can find an ending for it. If we can take authorship over these narratives, we can then end them. Because if you're not the author, of course, then you don't decide when the last page turns. So I think so what will come after this, Maybe Alice will write a book about reincarnation. If, I don't know. We don't know. I think that the category of women, of woman, is being itself complicated in very interesting ways. So as we move away from biology as destiny and essentialism, and think of womanhood as something that that we all participate in as a creative. That becoming a woman is sort of more creative than being or becoming a man. It always has been. Yeah, I think the majority of art, if we live long enough, will be made by women. And then we won't have to have panels like this because it will just be, you know, it would be redundant to say women's art at some point.
Amen.
Amen. I think that that's a good place to stop. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming.